In the winter of 1887, a construction crew working on the renovation of an old Catholic orphanage in rural Pennsylvania stumbled upon a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Beneath the floorboards of what had once been the dining hall, they uncovered 93 small wooden crosses, each carved with a child's name and a date spanning from 1834 to 1851. The discovery alone was chilling. But what made it even more disturbing was the fact that according to church records, Santa Eulalia Orphanage had housed exactly 93 children during its 17 years of operation. The workers quickly alerted the local authorities, but before any investigation could take place, representatives from the Diocese of Philadelphia arrived and confiscated all the evidence, claiming it was sensitive church property. Construction was abruptly halted, and within a week the building was demolished. The workers were paid handsomely to sign non-disclosure agreements, never to speak of what they'd found. For over a century, the truth about Santa Eulalia Orphanage remained buried. But recently uncovered letters and testimonies have revealed a disturbing tale that challenges everything we thought we knew about religious charity in 19th century America. Before we continue with the story of Santa Eulalia Orphanage, it's important to note that this channel isn't for the faint of heart. It's for those with the courage to uncover the darkest mysteries hidden in America's religious history. Few channels dare to explore these tale stories that reveal the shadows lurking behind sacred walls. If you have the bravery to discover the truth about what happened to those 93 children, hit the subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Are you brave enough to face the horrors that religious institutions have tried to keep buried for generations? The truth about Santa Eulalia begins in the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, where the faithful believed they were witnessing God's work, but were actually unknowingly funding something far more sinister. Millbrook in the 1830s was a quiet town of just 300 people nestled in the rolling hills of Lancaster County, settled by German immigrants generations earlier. The community was predominantly Lutheran and Reformed, with a small but growing Catholic population that had arrived with the Irish railroad workers who'd stayed after the Pennsylvania Railroad pushed through in 1832. It was a town where everyone knew everyone, where church bells marked the rhythm of daily life, and where orphaned children begging on the streets became an uncomfortable reminder of the harsh realities of the industrial age. Father Heinrich Kellermann, a stern Bavarian priest with piercing blue eyes and a reputation for unwavering discipline, led the Catholic community. He had arrived in Millbrook in 1833 with plans to build not just a church, but an entire complex to serve the spiritual and social needs of his growing flock. Father Kellermann, a man of considerable education who had studied theology in Munich before immigrating to America, possessed a charisma that inspired both devotion and fear. His idea for Santa Eulalia Orphanage came during a particularly bitter winter, when he saw several homeless children freezing in the town square. He saw not just a chance to serve God, but an opportunity to demonstrate Catholic charity to the skeptical Protestant majority. Within months, Father Kellermann had raised enough funds from wealthy Catholic benefactors in Philadelphia to purchase a large Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. The mansion, which had belonged to a failed textile merchant, was an imposing 3-story structure with tall windows and a wraparound porch. The townspeople watched as Father Kellermann transformed the mansion into what he called a beacon of Catholic compassion. Skilled craftsmen were hired to install a chapel in the east wing, convert the large drawing rooms into dormitories, and build a separate kitchen and dining hall. The most striking addition was a tall bell tower that rose from the center of the building. Its bronze bell, cast in Germany, was inscribed with the words "Laudate Dominum," meaning "Praise the Lord." In the spring of 1834, Sister Margaret Clare, an Irish nun from the Sisters of Mercy, arrived to serve as the orphanage's director. She was around 40 years old with prematurely gray hair and calloused hands from hard work. Those who met her described her as having kind eyes, but a mouth that rarely smiled and a commanding presence that made it clear she had spent her life caring for forgotten children. She was joined by two younger nuns, Sister Bernardet and Sister Catherine, both in their 20s, and eager to serve in what they believed would be a noble mission. The orphanage officially opened on June 15, 1834, with a ceremony attended by nearly the entire town. Both Protestant and Catholic families came to witness what the local newspaper called a shining example of Christian charity. Father Kellerman delivered a passionate sermon on the sacred duty of caring for the least among us, while Sister Margaret Clare stood silently beside him, her hands folded in prayer. The first children arrived soon after siblings orphaned by a factory accident, a young girl abandoned by a traveling performer, and boys who had been living as pickpockets on the streets of Philadelphia. The Catholic community embraced the orphanage with enthusiasm, organizing fundraisers, donating food and clothing, and volunteering their time to help with daily operations. Even some Protestant families moved by the obvious need contributed. However, from the start there were whispers about the strict discipline within the orphanage. Children were rarely seen playing in the yard, and when they did appear, they moved with the mechanical precision of soldiers, rather than the natural exuberance of youth. The bell in the tower rang not just for prayer times, but throughout the day and night, its toll becoming so frequent that townspeople began to complain about the noise disturbing their sleep. Local merchants delivering supplies to the orphanage reported that the children they glimpsed appeared unnaturally quiet and pale, always watched over by one of the nuns, whose hawk-like gaze never left their movements. When townspeople asked to visit or tour the facilities, Father Kellerman politely but firmly explained that the children required a structured environment free from outside distractions to properly develop their moral character. In the early months of its operation, the orphanage's reputation in Millbrook remained favorable, but there were subtle signs that something was amiss. Dr. Thomas Whitmore, the town's sole physician, recorded in his personal journal that he had never been called to treat any of the orphan children, even though he regularly treated nearly every other child in town for common ailments. When he questioned Father Kellerman about it, the priest assured him that Sister Margaret Clare, with her extensive medical training, was more than capable of handling any health issues that arose. As winter approached in 1834, the townspeople began to notice that the number of children at the orphanage seemed to fluctuate in ways that didn't match the known arrivals. Some claimed to have seen a specific child one week only to never see them again. When asked about these disappearances, Sister Margaret Clare would explain that children came and went according to God's will, many being blessed with placement in loving homes far away. The truth behind the walls of Santa Eulalia would remain hidden for another decade, but the seeds of horror were already being planted. The tolling bronze bell rang incessantly. The children remained unnaturally pale and silent, and Father Kellerman's sermons grew more focused on themes of sacrifice, obedience, and the purifying power of suffering. What the townspeople did not know was that Father Kellerman had brought with him from Bavaria more than just theological knowledge. He had also absorbed certain medieval Catholic practices that the Church had long abandoned, practices he believed were necessary to save not only the souls of the orphan children, but also the souls of the entire community. In his private chambers, he kept detailed journals written in Latin, documenting what he called the sacred work of purification, a task he believed God had chosen him to perform. The stage was set for 17 years of horror that would remain hidden until long after the last child vanished from Santa Eulalia. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on a bitter January morning in 1835, when Timothy Fletcher, the town's most reliable delivery boy, arrived at the orphanage with a wagon full of winter supplies. What he witnessed that day would haunt him for the rest of his life. though he wouldn't speak of it until he was on his deathbed 60 years later. Timothy had been making deliveries to the orphanage for months, always instructed to leave the goods at the service entrance and ring the bell once. Sister Bernardet would typically appear signed for the delivery and send him on his way with barely a word exchanged. But this particular morning, the bitter cold had frozen the lock on the service door, and Timothy could hear the unmistakable sound of children crying from somewhere deep within the building. Concerned that the children might be in distress, Timothy walked around to the front entrance where he found the main door slightly ajar. The crying was louder now, mingling with the sound of a woman's voice speaking in a language he didn't recognize. Following the sounds, he stepped into the entrance hall where the smell of burning candles mixed with something else, something medicinal and unpleasant that made his stomach churn. The crying came from the chapel, and as Timothy approached, he could see through the partially open door what appeared to be a religious ceremony. Sister Margaret Clare stood at the altar, her back to the door, speaking rapidly in Latin, while holding a small bundle wrapped in white cloth. Around her, a group of children knelt in perfect silence, their heads bowed so low that their foreheads nearly touched the floor. What disturbed Timothy most, however, was not the ceremony itself, but the children's appearance. Even from behind, he could see their clothing was torn and dirty, their bodies unnaturally thin, and some appeared to be shaking, though he couldn't tell if it was from cold fear or illness. The white bundle in Sister Margaret Clare's arms seemed to be moving, and Timothy's horror grew as he realized whatever was inside was alive. Just then, Sister Bernardet's voice shattered the silence. "Who dares to disturb the sacred work?" Timothy spun around to find the young nun standing directly behind him, her face contorted with a rage he had never seen in any religious person. Her habit was disheveled and her hands were stained with something dark that didn't look like ink. I brought the supplies," Timothy stammered, backing toward the door. "The service entrance was frozen and I heard crying." "There is no crying here," Sister Bernardet said, her voice eerily calm. "Only prayer. Only the holy work of purification." She stepped closer, and Timothy could smell something metallic on her breath. "You will leave now, and you will speak of this to no one. The work we do here is sacred, but it is not for the understanding of common people." She grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Swear it," she whispered. "Swear on your mother's grave that you will never speak of what you think you saw here." "I swear." Timothy gasped, his fear mounting, and the nun released him. He fled from the orphanage without looking back, leaving the wagon of supplies in the snow. That night, Timothy's mother found him in their barn, sitting in a daze, staring at nothing, with wide, frightened eyes. When she asked what was wrong, he simply said that he never wanted to make another delivery to the orphanage. She assumed he was just frightened by the strict nuns and agreed to send his older brother in his place. But Timothy's terror went far deeper than fear of stern religious women. What he had witnessed in that chapel would replay in his mind for decades, the unnatural silence of the children, their stiff kneeling as if their very lives depended on their stillness, and most disturbingly, the way Sister Margaret Clare had held that white bundle, as if it contained something both precious and terrible. The next day, Father Kellerman visited the Fletcher family personally, something he had never done before. He spoke privately with Timothy for nearly an hour, and when he left, the boy seemed more disturbed than ever. He began having nightmares that left him screaming in the night, and developed a stutter that wouldn't go away for months. Mrs. Fletcher, a devout Lutheran, tried to comfort her son by reminding him that Catholics had different ways of worship. But Timothy would only shake his head and whisper, "It wasn't worship, Mama." It was something far darker. When Timothy Fletcher was pressed to explain what he meant, he fell silent, refusing to speak any further. His brother Marcus took over the deliveries to the orphanage, but he too began to report strange occurrences. He noticed that the number of children visible through the windows seemed to change week by week. And on more than one occasion, he swore he heard singing coming from the basement. Though Sister Margaret Clare insisted the building had no such basement. Even more disturbing, Marcus began to find small items scattered around the orphanage grounds. Things like a child's shoe, a torn piece of fabric, and a wooden toy carved in the shape of a cross. When he asked Sister Bernarde about these items, she quickly gathered them up and explained that children often misplace their belongings. But Marcus noticed that the items never seemed to match the clothing or personal items of the children he saw through the windows. Dr. Whitmore, the town's physician, also took note of the strange reports surrounding the orphanage. His training as a doctor made him highly observant, and he began to keep detailed notes on the inconsistencies in the stories shared by the delivery boys and the few townspeople who had been inside the building. What troubled him most was the complete absence of any requests for medical assistance. In his 30 years of practice, he had never encountered a group of children who did not need at least occasional medical attention. When Dr. Whitmore offered his services for free, Father Kellerman politely declined, insisting that the children were in excellent health and that Sister Margaret Clare was more than capable of taking care of them. While the townspeople accepted this explanation, Dr. Whitmore, with his medical experience, was certain that no group of children, especially orphans, who had likely suffered from malnutrition and exposure, could maintain perfect health without proper medical intervention. He began to suspect that either the children were not healthy, or perhaps they were not even there at all. The first real evidence that something was terribly wrong came in the spring of 1835, when a traveling merchant named Jacob Reinhardt came to Millbrook with a troubling story. Reinhardt claimed that while passing through a town 50 miles east of Millbrook, he had encountered a young girl begging on the streets. The girl, who appeared to be about 10 years old, had fresh scars on her arms and spoke in terrified whispers about the orphanage, describing it as the place with the bell that never stops ringing. When Reinhardt asked her to explain further, the girl became hysterical and ran away, but not before mentioning the name Santa Eulalia. Disturbed by the encounter, Reinhardt made inquiries about the orphanage when he arrived in Millbrook. He was told by the locals that Santa Eulalia was a model institution, a place where God's work was being done. But something in their responses made him feel they were trying to convince both themselves and him. Father Kellerman soon learned of Reinhardt's inquiries and paid him a private visit at his inn that evening. The innkeeper later reported hearing raised voices and what sounded like threats. The next morning, Reinhardt left town without completing any business transactions and never returned to Millbrook. This marked the beginning of a disturbing pattern. Anyone who asked too many questions about the orphanage was either silenced or driven away. Father Kellerman had an uncanny ability to know exactly who was talking about the orphanage and what they were saying. The most unsettling development occurred later that spring, when the bronze bell in the orphanage tower began tolling at increasingly strange hours. Previously, the bell had rung only for prayer times and meals, but now it rang at midnight at 3 a.m., and sometimes it tolled continuously for hours during the day. When townspeople complained about the noise, Father Kellerman explained that the bell was marking the sacred hours of prayer and contemplation. Dr. Whitmore, however, recognized a pattern in the bell's tolling. His medical studies had taught him about the psychological effects of sleep deprivation and constant noise on the human mind. The bell seemed less like a call to prayer and more like a method of psychological torture designed to prevent anyone from sleeping soundly. But why would anyone want to torture children, Doctor? Whitmore couldn't understand it, but the thought gnawed at him. The summer of 1835 brought the first disappearance that couldn't be easily explained away. 8-year-old Anna Dietrich, whose parents had died during a cholera outbreak, had been brought to the orphanage by her aunt, Mrs. Elizabeth Hoffman, in the spring. Mrs. Hoffman had been promised that she could visit her niece once a month to ensure her well-being. But when she arrived for her second visit, she was told that Anna had been placed with a loving family in Baltimore and would not be returning. Mrs. Hoffman demanded to know the identity of this family so she could maintain contact with her niece. But Sister Margaret Clare claimed the adoptive family had requested complete privacy. When Mrs. Hoffman insisted on seeing some documentation of the adoption, she was told that all such records were confidential church property. Growing suspicious, Mrs. Hoffman refused to leave without more information and began questioning the other children. They seemed terrified to speak to her, and when she pressed them, they whispered that Anna had gone to the quiet place, and that they hoped they would never have to go there too. The situation escalated when Mrs. Hoffman demanded to search the entire building for her niece. Father Kellerman arrived, and in front of witnesses, had her physically removed from the property by two men he referred to as protectors of the church. Mrs. Hoffman left Millbrook that day and never returned. However, she spent the rest of her life writing letters to church authorities, demanding an investigation into what had happened to her niece. By the end of 1835, the pattern had become unmistakable to anyone willing to see it. Children arrived at Santa Eulalia were rarely seen or heard from again, and anyone who asked too many questions was either silenced or driven away. The bronze bell continued to toll at all hours. The children who could be glimpsed through the windows grew thinner and paler, and Father Kellerman's sermons became increasingly focused on sacrifice, purification, and the need for absolute obedience to God's will. The townspeople wanted to believe they were witnessing a great work of charity, but deep in their hearts, many began to suspect something far more sinister was happening behind the walls of Santa Eulalia. The question now was whether anyone would have the courage to uncover the truth before it was too late for the 93 children who had entered those doors. The winter of 1835 brought even more changes that the most willfully ignorant townspeople could no longer dismiss. The orphanage building itself began to take on a malevolent presence. Its tall windows glowed with candlelight at all hours, and shadows moved behind the glass in unsettling patterns, suggesting activities far more disturbing than simple prayer or study. Sister Catherine, the youngest of the three nuns, began showing signs of severe psychological distress. Those who encountered her during her increasingly rare trips to town noticed a pronounced tremor in her hands, and she flinched violently at sudden noises. Her once bright eyes had taken on a haunted look, and she had lost so much weight that her habit hung loose on her frame, like a burial shroud. Dr. Whitmore, whose medical curiosity had grown into genuine concern, began documenting these changes in his journal. He wrote, "Sister Catherine appears to be suffering from what I can only describe as a form of nervous exhaustion, typically seen in soldiers who have witnessed prolonged combat. The question that haunts me is, what war is being fought within the walls of that orphanage?" The answer came in fragments, whispered confessions from Sister Catherine during her rare interactions with townspeople. To Mrs. Mary Patterson, the baker's wife, she muttered, "The children, they try to be so good, but it's never enough. It's never enough for her." When Mrs. Patterson asked what she meant, Sister Catherine's eyes filled with tears, and she whispered, "Sister Margaret Clare says that suffering purifies the soul. But I fear we are not purifying anything. We are destroying it." These cryptic statements began to paint a picture of systematic abuse being carried out under the guise of religious discipline. Father Kellerman had created what he called the Sacred Method, a program of spiritual purification based on medieval monastic discipline combined with his obsession with child martyrdom. The method involved extreme fasting, physical penance, and a final purification that was hinted to be far darker than mere prayer. The bronze bell, once a simple call to prayer, now served as a psychological tool to instill fear and absolute obedience. Local merchant Samuel Crane, who had been delivering food to the orphanage for over a year, began to notice disturbing patterns in the supplies being ordered. The quantities seemed far too small for the number of children the orphanage supposedly housed, and the food ordered suggested a diet so restrictive it bordered on deliberate starvation. When he asked Sister Bernardet about it, she explained that the children were learning to find nourishment in prayer rather than food. More troubling were the special orders that began arriving from Philadelphia medical supplies, more suited to a hospital than an orphanage. These included laudanum surgical instruments and chemicals that Dr. Whitmore recognized as embalming fluids. When he asked about these supplies, he was told that Sister Margaret Clare was conducting advanced medical research approved by the church. But the truth behind her background began to emerge. Sister Margaret Clare had not trained with the Sisters of Mercy in Ireland, as she had claimed. She had been expelled from a convent in France for theological irregularities and dangerous innovations in the treatment of children. Sister Margaret Clare had developed a heretical interpretation of Catholic doctrine, combining extreme asceticism with a form of religious sadism. She believed that children, being naturally innocent, had the greatest capacity for spiritual purification through suffering, and that by subjecting them to increasingly severe trials, she could transform them into perfect vessels for God's grace. Those who survived were blessed with spiritual purity, while those who perished were considered martyrs. These children were allegedly buried in sacred ground beneath the orphanage. Timothy Fletcher, the delivery boy who had witnessed the strange ceremony in the chapel, began to experience vivid, disturbing dreams. He saw children kneeling in silence while Sister Margaret Clare performed rituals involving marking their bodies and forcing them to consume substances that made them violently ill. In his dreams, he also saw a hidden room beneath the chapel, where small wooden crosses were carved with names and dates, and the smell of earth mixed with something sweet and terrible. These dreams grew so vivid that Timothy began to wonder if he had actually seen more than he remembered during his visit to the orphanage. As Patrick O'Brien continued his work on the bell tower, he started to wonder if his mind had shielded him from the full horror of what he had witnessed, blocking out the most traumatic memories. The first undeniable proof of the orphanage's true nature came in the spring of 1836, when O'Brien, an Irish immigrant and experienced construction worker, was hired to repair the roof of the bell tower. Having worked on many church buildings before, he was skilled at moving quietly through religious spaces without disturbing the occupants. His job required him to access the tower via a narrow staircase that ran along the interior wall, giving him an unexpected view into several rooms that were otherwise hidden from public view. What O'Brien saw during his week of work on the tower would haunt him for the rest of his life. Through the windows of what appeared to be a dormitory, he witnessed Sister Margaret Clare conducting what she called morning purification, a ritual in which she forced the children to kneel naked on the cold wooden floor, while she examined their bodies for signs of what she considered spiritual impurity. Those who showed any sign of illness, injury, or even normal childhood curiosity were marked with ash on their foreheads and led away to a room O'Brien never saw them leave. More disturbing still was what O'Brien observed in the basement of the building, which Sister Margaret Clare had insisted did not exist. From a small window at ground level, O'Brien could see what looked like a makeshift medical facility, complete with a wooden table, surgical instruments, and jars containing what appeared to be human organs preserved in fluid. The walls were covered with detailed anatomical drawings, focusing on the internal structure of children's bodies. O'Brien, a devout Catholic who had fled religious persecution in Ireland, was shaken to his core by what he saw. He was torn between the urge to report the horrors he had witnessed and the knowledge that doing so could bring devastating consequences for the entire Catholic community in Millbrook. His decision was made for him on his final day of work, when he heard singing coming from the basement while adjusting the bell mechanism in the tower. Following the sound, he discovered a hidden entrance to an underground room where he found Sister Margaret Clare conducting what she called the final purification on a young boy who couldn't have been older than 7. The boy was lying on the wooden table, his small body marked with religious symbols that had been cut into his skin with surgical precision. Though he was conscious, the boy appeared to be in a state of extreme euphoria, most likely due to the laudanum that Sister Margaret Clare was administering through a cloth held over his nose. She was singing a Latin hymn while using her surgical instruments to remove what she described as the physical barriers to spiritual transcendence. O'Brien's horror deepened as he realized he was not witnessing a medical procedure, but a ritualistic murder being carried out in the name of religious purification. The boy's body showed signs of other injuries from previous purification scars, designed to gradually break down his physical form, supposedly allowing his soul to be released to join God in paradise. Unable to bear it any longer, O'Brien burst into the room and confronted Sister Margaret Clare. She showed no surprise or shame, but instead calmly invited him to witness what she called the moment of greatest spiritual beauty, the child's death. She explained that the boy had been chosen for this honor because he had achieved a level of spiritual purity worthy of martyrdom. Horrified, O'Brien grabbed the child from the table and ran, but it was too late. The boy died in his arms before he could reach Dr. Whitmore's office. His last words were a whispered Latin prayer that Sister Margaret Clare had taught him to recite during his final moments. The death of this unnamed child marked the beginning of the end for Santa Eulalia Orphanage, though it would take another 15 years for the full extent of the horror to be revealed. O'Brien's testimony would eventually lead to an investigation that uncovered the truth about the 93 children who had entered those doors. But first, O'Brien would have to survive the consequences of challenging an institution that had grown powerful enough to silence anyone who threatened its dark secrets. Following O'Brien's escape, Father Kellerman arrived at the construction site enraged. When told that O'Brien had left suddenly without completing his contract, the priest acted quickly, claiming that O'Brien had stolen valuable church property. He convinced the local sheriff to issue a warrant for O'Brien's arrest. But O'Brien had anticipated this response. Instead of fleeing Millbrook, he went directly to Dr. Whitmore's office, with the dying child knowing the physician's expertise would be crucial in documenting the abuse. Dr. Whitmore's examination of the child's body revealed clear signs of systematic torture, deliberate starvation, ritualistic cutting, and the administration of drugs designed to induce religious visions and compliance. Most disturbing of all, Dr. Whitmore discovered that the child's internal organs had been systematically damaged, suggesting that someone with medical knowledge had been conducting experiments on the boy's living body. The injuries resembled those described in medieval accounts of religious extremists who believed physical suffering could accelerate spiritual purification. Dr. Whitmore immediately documented his findings and sent copies of his report to medical colleagues in Philadelphia and New York to ensure the evidence would survive even if he were silenced. He also provided O'Brien with a detailed medical report to support any legal action against the orphanage. But the reach of Santa Eulalia's influence was vast. Within days of Dr. Whitmore's report, representatives from the Diocese of Philadelphia arrived, claiming that O'Brien was a known criminal and that his accusations against the orphanage were part of a conspiracy to discredit the Catholic Church. They produced what appeared to be official documentation, showing that O'Brien had been convicted of theft and fraud in Ireland before immigrating to America. Although the documents were forgeries, they were sophisticated enough to convince local authorities who were already uncomfortable with the idea of investigating a religious institution. The sheriff, under pressure from powerful Catholic families, used the forged documents as justification to issue a warrant for O'Brien's arrest on charges of theft, fraud, and making false accusations. O'Brien was forced to flee Millbrook, but not before he had shared his story with trusted individuals, including Timothy Fletcher, who had finally found the courage to speak about his own experiences at the orphanage. The testimonies of O'Brien and Fletcher corroborated each other in ways that made it impossible to dismiss their accounts as lies. Timothy's mother, Mrs. Fletcher, had initially been reluctant to believe her son's story, but after hearing O'Brien's account, she was convinced. She realized that her son's nightmares and behavioral changes were not the result of an overactive imagination, but of the horror he had witnessed. Mrs. Fletcher began secretly documenting everything she could about the orphanage, including the children who had been brought there, the inconsistencies in the nuns' stories, and the strange occurrences reported by townspeople over the years. Her investigation uncovered even more disturbing facts than O'Brien's testimony had revealed. The number of children who had supposedly been adopted was far higher than normal adoption rates, yet no families could be found to verify their placement. The orphanage's financial records showed payments for supplies that suggested they were housing far fewer children than they claimed. Most shockingly, Mrs. Fletcher discovered that Sister Margaret Clare had been in contact with individuals in Europe who shared her twisted beliefs about child martyrdom. These letters, obtained through a contact in the Postal Service, described in detail the methods Sister Margaret Clare had developed for systematic purification of innocent souls, methods that included using drugs, surgical procedures, and psychological techniques to induce spiritual visions. The letters also revealed that Father Kellerman, far from being a mere bystander, was the intellectual architect of the entire system. His theological training had led him to develop a justification for child murder, believing that deliberately killing children was the highest form of charity, as their souls would immediately ascend to heaven. The orphanage had received financial support from wealthy Catholic benefactors who believed their donations were going to a legitimate charitable cause, not to fund the systematic killing of children. As Mrs. Fletcher's investigation deepened, she realized the full scope of the horror at Santa Eulalia. The institution had not been saving children, but had been systematically murdering them under the guise of religious purification. The 93 children who had entered the orphanage had not been placed with loving families or sent to other institutions. They had been killed in ritualistic ceremonies designed to elevate them to the status of martyrs. Knowing she could not present her findings to local authorities, Mrs. Fletcher sought out a journalist named Edward Harrington, who worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Harrington had built a reputation as a fearless investigator of corruption within religious institutions, and he was already investigating rumors about Santa Eulalia. With his help, the truth about the orphanage's horrors would eventually come to light, but it would not be easy. Mrs. Fletcher, along with O'Brien Timothy and Dr. Whitmore, had made the dangerous decision to expose the dark secrets of Santa Eulalia Orphanage, knowing that powerful forces would stop at nothing to suppress their testimony. Harrington's investigation uncovered details that shook the very foundation of the religious establishment. He found that Father Kellerman had been expelled from his previous parish in Bavaria for what church records described as theological extremism and dangerous innovations in pastoral care. The priest had arrived in America under circumstances that suggested he was fleeing both scandal and possible legal consequences in Europe. More startlingly, Harrington discovered that Sister Margaret Clare was not a nun at all, but a former medical student who had been dismissed from a university in Paris for conducting unauthorized experiments on cadavers. She had assumed the identity of a deceased Irish nun and used forged credentials to gain admission to several religious institutions across Europe before eventually making her way to America. The journalist's research also revealed financial irregularities that suggested the orphanage was functioning as a front for a much larger criminal operation. Large sums of money were being funneled through the institution from untraceable sources, used to purchase supplies and services unrelated to childcare. As Harrington's investigation progressed, he began to receive anonymous threats, urging him to abandon his research. These threats escalated from simple warnings to physical violence when unknown assailants attacked him outside his hotel, beating him severely and warning him that he would be killed if he continued. But Harrington was not easily intimidated. Instead, the attack only strengthened his resolve. He and Mrs. Fletcher worked tirelessly to compile a comprehensive dossier that would expose not only the orphanage's crimes, but the entire network of corruption that had allowed such atrocities to continue. Their collaboration produced a devastating document filled with evidence so compelling it could not be dismissed. This dossier included copies of Sister Margaret Clare's correspondence with European contacts' financial records, showing the illicit flow of money medical evidence from Dr. Whitmore's examination of the murdered child, and testimonies from multiple witnesses who had observed suspicious activities at the orphanage. Perhaps most damaging was the timeline they compiled, revealing how the orphanage's operators had systematically eliminated anyone who posed a threat to their operation. The document showed that several individuals who had asked questions about the orphanage had died under mysterious circumstances, including Mrs. Elizabeth Hoffman, who had been found dead in a Baltimore hotel room shortly after demanding information about her missing niece. Just when Harrington thought he had uncovered the worst of the horror at Santa Eulalia, his investigation revealed a far-reaching conspiracy, one that extended beyond the orphanage itself. If this revelation is sending chills down your spine, you're not alone. Thousands of truth seekers in our community have chosen to confront these uncomfortable truths together. Share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to help others discover this story, and subscribe to join our brotherhood of truth seekers. Because what we're about to reveal next will challenge everything you thought you knew about religious institutions in 19th century America. In the winter of 1838, the investigation reached its climax when Harrington and Mrs. Fletcher finally obtained irrefutable evidence that Santa Eulalia Orphanage was indeed the site of systematic child murder. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sister Catherine, the youngest nun who had been exhibiting signs of severe psychological distress since O'Brien's escape, could no longer bear the guilt of what she had witnessed and participated in. She reached out to Mrs. Fletcher through an intermediary, offering her testimony about the horrific truth behind the orphanage's walls. Sister Catherine's confession, recorded in secret meetings over several weeks, provided details so horrifying that even Harrington, with his years of investigating institutional abuse, found himself struggling to maintain his composure. The young nun described the twisted process by which children were selected for purification, the ritualistic tortures they endured, and the gruesome methods used to dispose of their bodies. According to Sister Catherine, the selection process was based on Sister Margaret Clare's distorted assessment of each child's spiritual potential. Children who showed signs of rebellion, curiosity, or independent thinking were considered spiritually impure and marked for early purification, as were those who became sick or physically weak. The purification process took place in the basement rooms O'Brien had discovered. But Sister Catherine revealed that there were several such rooms, connected by hidden tunnels beneath the orphanage. The children selected for purification were told they had been chosen for a special honor to become angels of intercession who would pray for the souls of the living from their place in heaven. They were subjected to a gradual process of physical and psychological conditioning designed to break their resistance and make them eager participants in their own deaths. This process began with extreme fasting and sleep deprivation, followed by the administration of drugs that induced religious visions and euphoria. The children were taught special prayers and hymns that they were told would guarantee their immediate ascension to heaven. They were shown religious artwork depicting the glorious fate that awaited them after their transformation. The final stage of the process was what Sister Margaret Clare called the sacred surgery. These ritualistic mutilations were performed while the children were conscious but heavily drugged. The surgeries caused maximum suffering while prolonging the dying process, as Sister Margaret Clare believed the intensity of the child's pain would correspond to the spiritual power they would possess in the afterlife. Sister Catherine's testimony was so detailed that it caused Harrington to stop the interview several times, struggling to compose himself. The children were forced to recite prayers while religious symbols were cut into their flesh. Their organs were removed, and Sister Margaret Clare whispered comforting words as they died in agony. The bodies were then disposed of in a mass grave beneath the orphanage chapel. The wooden crosses later discovered by construction workers were part of a system of record-keeping, each one marking the death of a child who had been purified. Most shocking of all, Sister Catherine revealed that Father Kellerman was not only complicit, but had been the intellectual mastermind behind the entire operation. His theological background had led him to develop a twisted justification for child murder, believing that killing innocent children was the highest form of charity, as their souls would immediately ascend to heaven. The orphanage had received substantial financial support from wealthy Catholic families who believed they were funding a legitimate charitable cause. These families had no idea their donations were being used to purchase the drugs, surgical tools, and other materials necessary for the systematic murder of children. Sister Catherine also revealed that the orphanage was part of a larger network of institutions operating throughout America, and that Father Kellerman was in regular communication with church officials in Philadelphia, who were aware of the murders and even provided theological guidance for the acts. These officials believed that the orphanage's work would benefit the Catholic Church by providing new methods of spiritual purification through the study of extreme suffering. The conspiracy was much larger than anyone had realized. Harrington's investigation, combined with Mrs. Fletcher's extensive documentation, was poised to expose one of the most horrific secrets in American history. But as he prepared to publish the story, Harrington learned that his life was in danger. His hotel room was searched, his notes were stolen, and he received increasingly specific threats warning him to stop his investigation. When Sister Catherine failed to show up for a scheduled meeting, Harrington and Mrs. Fletcher went to the orphanage only to be told she had been transferred to another institution for medical treatment. In reality, Sister Catherine had been discovered by Father Kellerman and Sister Margaret Clare. She was subjected to the same purification process, and her death was made to look like a suicide brought on by religious melancholy. Sister Catherine's murder was the final piece of the puzzle that led Harrington to release his exposé. On March 15, 1839, his article, "The Angels of Santa Eulalia," appeared simultaneously in newspapers across 5 states, igniting a media firestorm that could not be suppressed. The story triggered federal investigations and congressional hearings, exposing corruption within religious institutions and beginning to unravel the vast conspiracy that had enabled the systematic murders at Santa Eulalia Orphanage. The impact of the Philadelphia Inquirer expose was immediate and devastating. Within hours of the story's publication, angry crowds gathered outside the now infamous Santa Eulalia Orphanage, demanding answers about the children who had supposedly been placed with adoptive families. Father Kellerman and Sister Margaret Clare, realizing their operation had been exposed, attempted to flee under cover of darkness, but they were apprehended by federal marshals mobilized to prevent the destruction of evidence. A search of the orphanage complex revealed horrors far beyond even Sister Catherine's detailed testimony. The hidden basement chambers contained not just surgical instruments and drug supplies, but detailed records of every child who had been murdered. The documents included sketches of the ritualistic mutilations inflicted upon the children and transcripts of their final words as they died. Most shocking of all was the discovery of Sister Margaret Clare's private journal, written in a mix of Latin and German, which outlined the full extent of her madness. The journal described her belief that she was conducting a divine experiment designed to determine the exact conditions necessary for human souls to achieve immediate sanctification. Sister Margaret Clare had kept meticulous records of how different combinations of physical torture, psychological manipulation, and drug administration affected the children during their final moments. She believed that the murdered children appeared to her in visions, thanking her for their purification and providing guidance for her continued work. She thought she was building an army of child saints who would intercede with God and bring about a new age of spiritual purification for humanity. Father Kellerman's confession, obtained under interrogation by federal investigators, revealed the theological framework that had justified the atrocities. He explained that his theories on child martyrdom had developed during his studies in Bavaria, where he had encountered medieval texts detailing similar practices among certain heretical sects. He had convinced himself that the Catholic Church's official condemnation of such practices was politically motivated and not based on genuine theological objections. The priest's confession also exposed the network of supporters who had enabled the orphanage's operation. He provided names and details about church officials, wealthy donors, and government authorities who had knowingly participated in the conspiracy. The corruption ran so deep that it ultimately led to resignations, criminal prosecutions, and sweeping reforms within multiple institutions. The excavation of the mass grave beneath the orphanage chapel confirmed the full extent of the horror. The remains of 93 children were recovered, their bones showing evidence of the systematic torture they had endured. The wooden crosses later discovered by construction workers had been placed there by Sister Margaret Clare as a form of record-keeping, each one carefully carved with the child's name and the date of their purification. Forensic examination of the remains provided gruesome confirmation of Sister Catherine's testimony. The children had been subjected to prolonged torture designed to maximize their suffering while keeping them alive as long as possible. The pattern of injuries was consistent with someone possessing medical knowledge but lacking any human compassion. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery was a hidden room containing Sister Margaret Clare's long-term plans for expanding her operation. The room contained detailed maps of potential locations for new orphanages throughout the American frontier, correspondence with individuals in Europe who shared her beliefs and financial projections for what she called the systematic purification of America's unwanted children. These documents revealed that Sister Margaret Clare viewed Santa Eulalia Orphanage as only the first step in a much larger project. She had been planning to establish a network of such institutions across the country, intending to process thousands of children per year in what she believed would become the largest group of martyred saints in Christian history. The investigation also uncovered evidence that some children had survived the orphanage's operations. These survivors, now adults, began coming forward with their own testimonies about the horrors they had witnessed and endured. Their accounts filled in crucial details about daily life within the orphanage and confirmed that the systematic abuse was even more extensive than the physical evidence had suggested. One survivor, Thomas Brennan, who escaped from the orphanage in 1840 at the age of 12, recalled how the children were forced to participate in mock funeral services for their fellow inmates, singing hymns of thanksgiving as their friends were taken away to be murdered. Another survivor, Mary O'Sullivan, described the systematic starvation and drug administration used to weaken the children's resistance. She remembered how they were taught to view their suffering as a privilege and were encouraged to compete for the honor of being selected for purification. These testimonies painted a chilling picture of an institution that functioned as a combination of concentration camp, medical laboratory, and religious cult. The children had been systematically dehumanized and conditioned to accept their own deaths as divine blessings. The trial of Father Kellerman and Sister Margaret Clare became one of the most sensational legal proceedings of the 19th century, attracting international attention. The evidence presented during the trial was so overwhelming that both defendants were convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. Sister Margaret Clare showed no remorse for her actions, maintaining that she had been doing God's work and that her victims were now among the most blessed souls in heaven. Father Kellerman, on the other hand, seemed to suffer a complete psychological breakdown during the trial, alternately claiming that he had been deceived by Sister Margaret Clare and insisting that their actions were justified by divine revelation. The exposure of the Santa Eulalia conspiracy had far-reaching consequences. It prompted congressional investigations into the oversight of religious institutions, led to new laws requiring government inspection of orphanages and other child care facilities, and sparked national discussions about the potential for abuse within religious organizations. The Catholic Church, initially trying to distance itself from the scandal, was ultimately forced to acknowledge that some of its officials had been complicit in the crimes. This led to significant reforms within the church hierarchy, including new procedures for monitoring religious institutions that served vulnerable populations. The demolition of Santa Eulalia Orphanage in 1887, nearly 50 years after the exposure of its crimes, marked the final chapter in one of the most disturbing episodes in American religious history. The building, too tainted by its history, had stood empty for decades, gradually deteriorating as nature reclaimed the site. The discovery of the wooden crosses during the demolition served as a haunting reminder of the individual lives lost to Sister Margaret Clare's madness. In 1934, nearly a century after the orphanage's crimes were revealed, the town of Millbrook erected a memorial on the site to honor the 93 children who had died there. The simple granite stone was engraved with the names of all the victims, surrounded by a small garden where visitors could leave flowers or offer prayers. Though the physical remnants of the orphanage were gone, the dark legacy of Santa Eulalia Orphanage continues to serve as a solemn reminder of the dangers of unchecked religious power and the lengths to which corruption can reach when it is allowed to fester unchecked. The inscription on the memorial reads, "In memory of 93 innocent souls whose lives were taken by those who claim to serve God. May their deaths serve as a reminder that we must never allow faith to be used as a justification for cruelty, and that we must always be vigilant against those who would harm the vulnerable in the name of righteousness." Today, the Santa Eulalia case is studied in law schools, seminaries, and psychology programs as a chilling example of how institutional corruption and religious extremism can combine to create conditions that enable systematic abuse. The detailed records from the investigation continue to offer deep insights into the psychology of both perpetrators and victims of institutional abuse. This case serves as a stark reminder that the protection of vulnerable populations requires constant vigilance from ordinary citizens. The children who perished at Santa Eulalia Orphanage were failed not just by the individuals who murdered them, but by a community that chose to ignore warning signs and avoid asking uncomfortable questions. The bronze bell, which once tolled incessantly from the orphanage's tower, was melted down after the building's demolition. The metal was repurposed to cast a new bell for Millbrook's Lutheran Church. This new bell rings only for traditional church services and special occasions, its clear, pure tone now serving as a symbol of redemption and hope for a community that had learned the hard way about the consequences of willful blindness. This story illustrates that evil can often hide behind even the most sacred facades. Institutions that claim to serve God can sometimes become instruments of unspeakable cruelty. The 93 children who died at Santa Eulalia did not perish due to supernatural forces or inexplicable evil, but because human beings chose to prioritize their own beliefs, comfort, and social standing over the welfare of vulnerable children. What do you think, Horatio? What do you think of this story? Do you believe that all the truth about Santa Eulalia has been revealed? Or could there still be other secrets buried in America's religious history? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts on how communities can better protect vulnerable children from institutional abuse. If you found this dark chapter of American history intriguing and want to hear more stories that uncover the hidden horrors behind sacred walls, subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell and share this video with someone who isn't afraid to confront uncomfortable truths. Remember, only by acknowledging the darkness of the past can we hope to build a brighter future. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another mystery that challenges everything you thought you knew about America's religious institutions. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.